Alors, nous allons quitter le bassin méditerranéen pour nous diriger vers la Mésoamérique. Donc, j'accueille Stephen Houston, qui est professeur à la Brown University de Providence, donc dans l'État de Rhode Island. Stephen Houston est professeur spécialiste de la culture maya, archéologue. Donc, il a fouillé 2 sites au Guatemala, El Zotz, et donc il a aussi achevé récemment des sessions archéologiques à Piedras Negras au Guatemala. Donc, je lui laisse la parole.
Okay. And my apologies again for presenting in English, but I hope to be as clear and lucid as possible. It's a great honor to be here today, and I have entitled this talk Fits and Starts, with the idea of actually focusing on decipherment as a matter of both revolutions of understanding and also of incremental progress in exploring ancient writing systems. That is, there is both very sudden and very gradual progress in all of the work that we do. Now, we are here, of course, in honor of this gentleman, François Champollion, whom, as we learned yesterday, deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs in a stunning way about 200 years ago. Now you can see here his renowned letter to Monsieur Dacier, who was the perpetual secretary of the Royal Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres here in Paris. But at the outset, I think it's important to absorb the fact that in some ways, Champollion's code-breaking serves as a precedent for all decipherments anywhere in the world. The reason for this inspiration is very clear. It comes from its brilliance, it comes from its éclat, its elegance, its power, and it's focused on an overall system of analysis and the attributes of writing. And indeed, in very personal terms, he has achieved a near immortalization as a result of this breakthrough. And this takes me, of course, here to my situation. I have been focused on Maya decipherment now for over 40 years. This is a writing system employed in ancient Mexico and northern central America. And in this image, you can see a colonial record, a biscript, a Rosetta Stone, of the Maya writing system. And we'll return to this a bit later as well. Now, I've also had the privilege of working here in Paris with Andreas Stauder, with the joint task being of examining the joint or tandem features of Egyptian and Maya hieroglyphs. Now, why undertake this comparison? It's because these are both hieroglyphic systems. They do not consist of angular or smooth lines such as we've seen this morning, but they have a mass, they have a form. They depict things in the world in a way that is innately and intensely pictorial. And so this integration of text and picture is nearly unique to these systems, and therefore worth comparison. Now, there's another reason to focus on this connection between the Egyptian and Maya script, and it has to do with the person you see before you here, Constantin Rafinesque, whom you probably have not heard of. Although he was born in Constantinople, he was, like Champollion, a citizen of France. An autodidact, he came with his exploratory and adventurous soul to the state of Kentucky in the United States of America, where he became a professor at Transylvania University, which has nothing to do with Bram Stoker or Dracula, but it is rather a place where he was eventually interred after dying in obscurity. On the campus of that university, he lies under a tombstone that reads, "Honor to whom honor is overdue." He was an extraordinary polymath, versed in many branches of science, including the discovery in my writing of how we should interpret their signs for numbers. Here, for example, is the number 12. It consists of 2 bars, each for units of 5, and then there are 2 dots, each for units of 1. Now, he was clearly aware of Champollion there in the forests of Kentucky. And in fact, he addressed a formal academic letter to Champollion the same way that Champollion had addressed Monsieur Dacier a short time before. Now, alas, Champollion was never to receive this letter. He had died a few months before, in March 1832, and was already lying, as I understand it, in Père Lachaise Cemetery, not too far from here. And in fact, I have to tell you that when Champollion wrote about Mexican writing, he did so in rather dismissive terms, and he was probably affected by the evolutionary understandings that Dr. Chambon was speaking about a short time before. He failed to understand its semantic and phonic nuances. But the broader point I want to make this morning has to do with this, is that there are really three models of decipherment that we can discuss. The first is what I would describe as the heroic view of this intellectual process, in which we're not only looking at a specific individual, but a kind of persona, not an individual, but someone who is paradigmatic for a broader class of genius. It's a performative character or role. Now here you can see Champollion as he changes through the life and the ages, a very sedate young man in his library with the classical setting in the background and the drapery. By 1828, he has gone completely native, as you can see here, one of my favorite photographs of any epigraphist. This is in Egypt, as I understand it. And then long after his death, and this is an important image, he is depicted as this effete, aesthetic character, as you can see to the side. He is a stock personage. He has become a character for the ages. He is the decipherer, the crucial person who was able to go from an original idea that defies preconceptions into an entirely new view of the script that he was studying. He has gone beyond individual signs to a systematic comprehension of a writing system, how it operated as an overall means of recording sound and meaning. And all of this implies a breakthrough, a very sudden flash of inspiration which takes place rapidly. And everything we learned yesterday showed that there was in fact an ecosystem in which Champollion operated. Now, for the second model of decipherment, let's turn to a photograph of me at Aguateca, Guatemala, about 20 years ago. And I'm engaged here in a much more mundane sort of decipherment. I'm looking at a newly found text and very disrespectfully sitting on that inscription, I'm embarrassed to say, and I'm translating this on a case-by-case basis. That is, yes, there's new evidence, but I'm predicating my work on a set of tools and resources that are available to us to read this inscription. I'm going to set that aside and go to the incremental view of decipherment, which I feel is just as important and needs to be emphasized. This is not a revolution like Champollion's, but one that builds on previous work. It involves gradual sign-by-sign progress in understanding how an ancient script actually worked. We have to determine the motivation for each sign, and this intellectual labor is especially critical for hieroglyphic systems that depict the world around us, or rather the world seen by the makers and producers of these writing systems. Now that process concerns the detection of sound and meaning and establishing why signs look the way that they do. What is their motivation? So what I'm going to do today is to reconcile these two perspectives. We're going to leave the mundane view of decipherment to the side. We're going to try to reconcile the heroic and the incremental decipherments, demonstrating that both are necessary to a fuller accounting of earlier systems. Now, to put this in the broader setting, I am going to be looking here at my advisor at Yale, Michael Coe, to my regret, died not long ago. He felt that several things needed to be in place before there might be improved chances for decipherment. There had to be a known language. Of course, Champollion had understood the crucial role of Coptic, as we all know. And Michael Coe also proposed that there had to be a biscript or a triscript or a tetrascript and so forth of a known system into an unknown one. And this was a necessary entree because it went from what was readable to a text one wished to read. A large database would be necessary. There's my slide for the triscripts and biscripts. The databases would give you a useful testing ground for new ideas. And then there had to be a sense of the cultural setting that would be expected from the salient or dominant interests of this society that produced the writing system. That is, what would be most likely to be recorded therein. And finally, and this is especially so of hieroglyphic systems, there need to be controls in place, pictorial controls, a way of cross-testing evidence. And I would venture to say, finally, and there you can see that particular image, that there needs to be an understanding of the ecosystem. That is, there have to be several people in dialogue, in animated discourse. There are those who wrote the script, and then there are those who analyze them, and these are two separate matters. For instance, as we all know, we have this vision of the decipherer as a lone hermetic genius, and that's simply nonsense. We know that animated discourses have to take place. There can be antagonistic discourses, such as famously existed between Champollion and Thomas Young over in England. It is that very rivalry that gives impetus to decoding. There are personalities involved here, let's face it. But there may also be more amiable conversations, such as yours truly here with my good and talented friends David Stewart and Dmitry Belyayev of Russia. The intensity of that contact is indispensable to sustain progress. There has to be also an attention to writing systems in general, I firmly believe. And that's why it's so important to gather people, as we have done over these days at the Louvre, in order to discern what is held in common and what is truly singular. Now let's talk at this juncture about a largely cracked code, namely Maya glyphs, used from approximately the few centuries before Christ until the early colonial period. Again, this writing system was used in the tropical cities of northern Central America and Mexico. And I will also return to Mike Coe's points. And there's Mike again. Hi there, Mike. His dicta for what it needed to be in place for successful decipherments. Now, it just so happens that with my writing, we have many, many texts. And here you see one of very great length that comes from the city behind Mike here, in deep relief from the city of Dos Pilas in Guatemala, where I did my doctoral research. Now, as for language, the Mayan examples really came to public attention first in an area where Yucatec Maya was spoken, up in Yucatan Peninsula, with some related outliers to that language to the south. This is a Yucatec shaman or heman who is involved in agricultural rituals in this photograph. Now, I use this plural languages, as you see in this slide, in this image, because there are, by some estimates, 29 different Mayan languages. And there's not one, there are many, and they are sometimes often mutually unintelligible. And this shows you where they are distributed. The size of the label, as in Yucatec, corresponds roughly to the number of speakers today, some being spoken by very many, others very few. Now, it turns out that by looking at the glyphs themselves, we are able to discern what the main language of the inscriptions might have been. And this is research that I did about 20 years ago. Here's an example of a suffix that occurs on a verb class that I helped to identify with colleagues. It is a syllable yi. We'll explain later how we came to define these syllables. And this is part of a class of verb that is only found in one of those 29 languages. Which one is it? It is Orti Maya, spoken on the boundary today between El Salvador and Guatemala. There are about 12,000 speakers left, approximately, and this is a Orti woman before you. Now, curiously enough, it is on the border of the Mayan world today, but it appears to have been a language during the main period of the inscriptions, which was more like a medieval Latin or a sort of lingua franca, and this has come as a surprise to many of us. Now, what about the context and setting, those other of Michael Coe's dicta for decipherment? Well, it turns out we know that the Maya who created this writing system lived in royal courts. They were surrounded by courtiers who were at their beck and call, attending on their needs. They were interested in warfare and in political expansion and in the necessities and the symbolics of sacred kingship. All of these would presumably be reflected in the writing system, and indeed they are. The other item to remember is that, as in all hieroglyphic scripts, there are pictorial clues that help us to decode Maya hieroglyphs. Here, to give one example, is a Maya chocolate vase dating to approximately AD 600 to 700, which shows, it's probably from northern Guatemala. It shows a deer, a bipedal deer, which I defy you to see in nature itself. It's probably a brocket deer, to judge from the tiny antlers or horns. Now, he's also holding, believe it or not, an enema, which is a syringe used for wild parties. This is how alcohol was frequently ingested at Maya courts, apparently to avoid stomach upsets and hangovers. I would not try this at home, however. Now, over to the side, you can see two hieroglyphs, which are syllables, chi and he, spelling the Maya word chi. And this is the puzzle, which I've discussed with Andreas. Why bother include this information? There is a kind of excess of data, of evidence that the Maya place in these images, which in themselves present an interesting analytical and interpretive challenge to us today. Why does this exist? Is this something that is most appropriate to hieroglyphic systems? We simply don't know. Now, Coe also mentioned biscripts. Now, Champollion famously had his triscript to work with, and for the Maya, we have this, a biscript from a document recorded in approximately 1566, and it shows, as you can make out here, Mayan glyphs with Latin equivalents directly above. This came from a Bishop Diego de Landa, who sat down with a scribe and was able to record this Rosetta Stone for Maya research. We called it for a long time the abecedario, or the alphabet, but we'll see why that's very wrong. Now, I also believe that these triscripts and biscripts and so forth urgently need comparative attention. They're not just a given or something to take for granted. They exist in conditions of cultural contact and collision, and the spacing and the positioning of them relative to one another is always quite fascinating. So that if, for instance, if we look at the Rosetta Stone, and this is from a Richard Parkinson book as a speculative reconstruction, you can see that there's an order to this, in which probably there is a prestige hierarchy that is playing out on the surface of the stone, in which we have, for instance, up above the Egyptian hieroglyphs, then it goes to, of course, the secondary Egyptian inscription below, and then finally to the Greek. The positioning here, I do not think, is irrelevant to the decisions behind composing this stone, and that is equally true for the Maya example, in which we have Latin above, and then we have suddenly below the Maya hieroglyphs themselves. Now, let's go to a revolution. Let's start with that. And we're going to turn to this gentleman, Yuri Knorozov, who has always an astonishing haircut, and you can see one example right here. And his central focus was a document called the Dresden Codex, which miraculously survived the firebombing by the British in the latter years of, final year, I believe, of World War II. It dates to approximately, this document, AD 1450, according to some estimates, and you can see that it's filled with complementary picture text references, which are going to be very important for decipherment. Now, Knorozov, who died about 25 years ago, took this abecedario, this alphabet, seriously probably not for the first time, but certainly for the first time effectively so. And what he was able to do is to quickly determine that it was not an alphabet, but it was a syllabary. That is, it consisted of consonant-vowel combinations. And if you look here, you can see that in this document, we're going to focus on one in particular, the syllable ka, which we would render today with the ka, not the ca. But it's important to understand at the outset that paleography always plays a role. There is no single period of Egyptian writing. There's no single period of Mayan writing either. And this exploration of how forms change over time takes us into the classic period in which most of the Maya glyphs were recorded. That over to the lower right-hand side is a classic period version of Landa's ka. Now, what's fascinating is sometimes they will double it, and the probable reason for this is because it comes from the word for fish, and they're probably showing the gills. There's this minute attention to the world around them, which infinitely fascinates those of us who look at it. Now, how are these syllables produced? We are fairly clear that they are produced in the following way. They start with a Maya word. It could be the word leaf, yop. It could be the word fish, kai. And in both of these cases, what the Maya did was they simply cut off that final consonant or glide, thereby leaving simply the first consonant and the vowel. That has produced the syllable that was then employed in this writing system. How do we go beyond this abbreviated sense of what is in the Landa? Well, this was Knorozov's great breakthrough. And what he did was he turned to the Dresden Codex in particular, where you have these marvelous text-picture combinations, where we have cross-testing resources available to us. And what he did was, and this is one example that is really quite famous, he would first look at a picture, and those are respectively a turkey, and then over the side is a howling dog. You can see the speech scroll coming out of his throat. And what we have here is an example of syllables that come from Landa. There is, for instance, the syllable ku, which we knew about from this document dating to 1566. So far, so good. We have that in place. But then what Knorozov decided to do was, in view of the picture that was there with that text, accompanying that text, is he thought, well, maybe that next to it is yet another syllable, which I will now evaluate in two different probative contexts. And he conjectured that is the syllable tsu. Now, if you bring these together, what is left behind is kutsu, kuts. What is left behind is tsulu, tsul. And so in all of these cases, he starts with the known, what is in our own Rosetta Stone, and then he interpolates, he injects an unknown supposition, a suggestion, a proposal, and from that comes the reading itself. And as you can see, that is manifestly a turkey, it has the wattle coming down, and that is a dog up above. And then what he would do is he would look at another context, such as a written version of the word for the number 11, buluk. You see a lu there, you see a ku, both from Landa, and then even though the other element is missing, we know from all Mayan languages that the word for 11 is buluk. Why did they think that was a particular quantitative element? It's because they had other evidence nearby to suggest that would be the case. And so this, Knorozov is justifiably our Champollion. He is justifiably a heroic figure. He's also been involved in more recent politics. Putin himself, just a few weeks ago, declared him by presidential decree a national hero. There have been stamps in his honor. There are sculptures and statues throughout modern-day Russia to this gentleman. And so we have to always understand that figures like Champollion and figures like, of course, Knorozov exist in the present too. They're still with us, and they're discharging their performative roles. Now, I'm going to return to that amiable pair to deal with increments. And that amiable pair of discussants is me, and it's my friend Dmitry Belyayev from Russia. And what we saw in the earlier slide was the necessity of active discourse. And we can begin with a puzzle which we believe we have recently unraveled as in this ongoing incremental process of decipherment. So I have 5 minutes left. And it has to do with human heart sacrifice practiced among the Maya. And what we have here are, respectively, two figures to either side. In the middle is a jeweled captive. His hair is bleached blonde, probably to make him more palatable to the sun god. He's got jade jewels in his hair as well. And he's being leaned over a stone to open up his thorax, probably for heart extraction. So we know that these images occur in Maya art, but what happens in terms of the writing system? Now here, we're going to look at a glyph that consists of a human hand that is holding up a little curved blade, and it is shown here in a glyph and is shown here in an image. That blade has respectively a curving a little hook on it, and it has the Maya sign for darkness. Now, what can this possibly be? That is an obsidian blade. It's an extremely sharp volcanic glass that can easily slice through human flesh, probably the better, in this instance, to extract a human heart. Now, we can start testing this using our knowledge of syllables and our understanding of Maya art. This is showing a rollout of a Maya pot about the same time, perhaps a few years after the pot that showed the deer I was displaying before. And what it has are two figures. There's one holding this blade, and then over to the side is a remarkably nonchalant figure, hunched over, and his back has been sliced open, presumably with this blade. Now, what do the syllables tell us? They tell us directly above a date, probably in mythological time, and they read out hutach, probably Yahpat, which means the wounded back. It has been sawn or marked with the blade. It's spelling it out in the image. It is spelling it out explicitly in the hieroglyphs itself. Now, if we turn back again, you can see that all of this makes consistent sense of the text. It makes consistent, congruent sense of the image as well. It is that harmonious combination of elements that is so crucial to decipherment. Now, to conclude here, how does this relate to finding not so much syllables, but to a word sign we had not known about, and to accessing entirely unmentioned and unrecorded, hitherto unrecorded events in Maya dynastic worldview? Well, this is a pot that is also from northern Guatemala. It has syllables on it, and it has by it the syllables kupoma, yo, and then two word signs, ol, ahin, afterwards. And this can be rendered into English as cut with a saw, sacrifice the heart of the turtle, a crocodile, the crocodile is being opened or up. Now that image is fascinating because it actually shows someone from a much earlier time in Maya history. We know this from the style of the costuming. We know it from the name itself because this is of an earlier king of the Maya who is being commemorated at a later date. Now, what this tells us is, therefore, that we have syllables being laid out, and we also have alternative versions of this name where they're using a substituted word sign that shows nothing less, nothing other than a hand holding up the obsidian blade just before. And it must have been read kup. The syllables specify this, and we can now extend further into the vocabulary of classic Maya ritual. And so this is a new controlled setting. This is work we just did a few months ago. It's ongoing. It's not ending. Now, I would say that the Maya were fascinated by crocodile sacrifice, and in a tomb of someone who might actually have been that individual or someone who knew that individual is a sacrificed crocodile. And we don't know exactly if there are cut marks over the thorax, but there might well have been. So to conclude, and I hope I haven't gone on too long, I've called this fits and starts, which is really simply an alternative way of telling you that there are both revolutions and increments in all of the decipherment that takes place. And that, in point of fact, this is a complex process. And it is the stunning, incandescent, pioneering example of Champollion that has led us to understand that decipherment is doable, that it's within our reach, and that it will be never-ending as we go into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My question is about the caption that you showed us on the chocolate cup. Would you agree that it's maybe not entirely superfluous to caption this image? I know my neighbor and I didn't recognize the deer, so people who didn't have the cultural codes in other terms.
Right. It's an excellent suggestion, which is most deer do not walk bipedally, as I think we can all agree. So maybe that was necessary to specify it. But there are other examples, too, in which it's very obviously this creature or that beast, and yet they're using the hieroglyphs for this purpose. And it's a conversation that Andreas Stauder and I have had, because as I understand it, Egyptian has some of this as well, where there's a hyper or almost excessive specification of information that would already be there. Now, I suspect we're getting here into the ontology of the writing system. We're getting into what is behind the mental process of creating these systems of graphic representation. But the extraordinary thing here, which is that they're both always kept separate, but they're always in unison. They walk hand in hand. They're married in a sense, but they're not necessarily joined as one. So it's a conversation that I would love to continue about that topic. It's fascinating, truly.
As there are still many Mayan languages still in use in Central America, does that give you another reading of the ancient glyphs?
What was the first part of the question?
As there are still many Mayan languages still used.
Yes. There are many Mayan languages still in use, 28 or so. Some are in extremis. They might have 50 speakers. Others have hundreds of thousands. And so using historical linguistics, we can sort out the history of these languages in a very complex way, such as has been done with Indo-European and with the Greek that was just discussed this morning. And it is a fabulous resource. I can't emphasize enough that our data are extraordinary. And there's so much more to do. So I encourage everyone here to drop what they're doing and start getting into Maya decipherment, because we need help. So it's a great question, yeah.
Nous allons clore la session, puisqu'effectivement,